Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, and I'm excited for you to join me on Heroes in the Bible, Jesus. Please follow this podcast on Apple or Spotify to get the latest episodes so you can continue strengthening your relationship with Jesus. Welcome to the greatest story ever told. It is a tale of a shepherd's heart for his sheep, a father's love for his children, and a hero's triumph over death and darkness. This is a story that continues to shape and mold the world around us, bringing the divine heart of God right into the heart of you and I. In this episode, we meet the revered and loved Mary and Joseph. They are chosen to take on a tremendous burden and great blessing. This episode reminds us that being called does not always mean being comfortable. These two ordinary people are going to embark on an extraordinary journey of faith, love, and destiny. I love how the epic adventure of the life and ministry of Jesus begins in an unremarkable place with unremarkable people. Unlike other religious origin stories, Jesus isn't born from a volcano or sculpted from dragon scales. He's born and raised with ordinary people. You and I will get a glimpse into the humble context Jesus was born into and the noble people that were chosen to parent him. This episode is a sweet reminder to all of us that God does extraordinary things through ordinary people. This episode reminds me of 2 Corinthians 4:7, which says, "We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure." This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. God chooses to store his power and glory in us fragile humans. I love how in the process he makes us strong. That is what will happen in this episode. But first, we will begin with a prelude. This prelude reveals a promise that was etched upon the hearts of God's people. Let's begin with episode 2, You Are Chosen. Be sure to stay tuned afterwards as we unpack the themes and treasures from this episode. Talk to you soon.
Prelude to Chapter 2.
Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. I am your protector and blessing forevermore.
God's voice whispered softly. Abram closed his eyes and allowed the midnight breeze to glide across his face. He was on his knees, with fists gripping the tall grass below. Abram was troubled and doubted God's willingness to bless him. He had left his home to follow God's calling. Yet now, as he advanced in years, the true desire of his heart had eluded him. He was still childless and feared dying without an offspring to carry on his name. Abram slammed his forehead into the ground and wept.
"O Lord, but what good is your blessing if it dies with me? I am still childless. Shall everything you gave me go to my servants?"
The wind whistled through the valley, blowing against Abram's kneeling body.
Look up, Abram.
God whispered.
Look and behold my glory.
Abram looked to the heavens. Bright stars filled the skies like ripples in the sea. The galaxy could be seen stretching across the firmament. Abram stood in awe of the vastness of God's creation. A single tear streamed down his face as God spoke to him again, saying,
Do you see these stars, Abram? Are you able to number the lights above?
Abram's eyes glowed as he basked in the glory above. The wind blew in his ears as God spoke boldly, proclaiming,
I will make your offspring outnumber the stars. Through your seed, all the nations will be blessed. I will raise up a nation through you. You need only to believe.
Abram planted his feet firmly on the ground and raised his arms. He yelled to the heavens as the winds howled. He beamed from cheek to cheek, soaking in the presence of his God. He believed in God's promise. He believed that one day God would raise up a hero from his offspring, one that would bless the whole world through the light and love of God. Chapter 2. You are chosen. Mary rose from her bed and breathed in the arid morning air. A dim light was peeking slightly through the lattice of her humble home. Mary quietly removed her blanket and stealthily climbed out of bed, trying not to wake her siblings sleeping beside her. After getting dressed, she stepped outside. The air was dry and cool. Goats were beginning to emerge to the rooster's call, and families were beginning to stir awake. Retrieving a pail for water, Mary made her way down to the single well in town. Nazareth was a poor village. The only remarkable thing about it was just how unremarkable it was. It was far from the trade routes, nowhere near the sea, and lacking the rich culture many other cities had. There was no rich history of brave heroes, and certainly no new and exciting events to share. Nazareth was a predictably dull place. But for Mary, there was reason to be excited. She walked down the dusty pathway to the well, stumbling on the occasional hole in the ground. The dark-haired young woman playfully hummed and trotted along, hoping to cross paths with the stonemasons making their way to the quarry. She made her way to the well and drew the water slowly, allowing her eyes to wander in the distance towards the path leading up the hill. She continued to hum, doing her best to not look desperate as other women began to approach the well. As she drew the last of her water, she could hear the footsteps of a few men making their way towards the quarry. Mary blushed as she caught sight of Joseph carrying his tools with the other craftsmen. Joseph was not known for his strong spirit or his rugged good looks. He was a humble craftsman who was best known for his kind heart and devotion to the Lord. The two of them were betrothed and had committed themselves to be married in just a few short months. To Mary, he represented something new, a small sliver of excitement in an otherwise dull existence. The two locked eyes, and Joseph grinned ear to ear at the sight of his bride-to-be. He waved with an almost childish enthusiasm and was immediately teased by the men walking beside him. The two of them blushed, allowing others to playfully harass them. As Joseph continued his way towards the quarry, Mary finished filling her pail. She stumbled up the slight incline back to her home. Her siblings had gone off to feed the animals, and no doubt her father and mother had departed to work and tend to the home. She waddled with the heavy pail in both her arms and propped the door open with her foot. Backing into the room, Mary turned around to see a creature perched on the lattice of her room.
"Greetings, O favored one,"
the angel exclaimed. Mary gasped, and the entire pail of water spilled everywhere. Mary backpedaled at the sight of the angel and slipped onto the floor. Her head hit the ground with a thud, and she let out a slight shriek of pain. Grasping her head and clumsily stumbling to her feet, Mary turned to dart for the door. Before she could take another step, the angel was right in front of her. He gave a reassuring smile and said,
"Please, do not be afraid. The Lord is with you."
Mary looked at the angel, perplexed, but slightly less afraid. She backed away slowly and sat on the side of her bed. The angel opened up his arms and said,
"I am Gabriel, and I have come with good news. You, O favored one, are chosen."
What does that mean?
Mary asked, rubbing the back of her head.
"You have found favor with God, Mary.
Gabriel explained.
You are the one he has chosen to bear the greatest burden and blessing this world has ever known."
Gabriel's tone shifted for a moment, as if he was playing a harp with his words.
"You, Mary, will conceive a son. In your womb will be the chosen one of God. He will be the great and mighty Son of the Most High, and on his back the weight of all mankind will be carried." The Lord will restore his kingdom in him, and he will be given the throne of his father David. His kingdom will have no end, and his glory will reign into all eternity."
Mary's jaw was nearly hitting the floor as she listened to Gabriel. She shook her head in dismay.
How are these things possible? I'm a virgin. I am very young and have not yet known a man.
Mary's eyes were beginning to water. She was overwhelmed by the whole experience. Gabriel was perched high above Mary, but decided to come down at eye level. He tilted his head to the side and looked Mary in the eyes.
"All things are possible with God, Mary.
The creature smiled and raised his hands.
The Holy Spirit will come upon you. The power of the Most High God will overshadow you. The child will be the Son of God himself."
Mary's eyes widened in dismay.
"No doubt you have heard that your cousin Elizabeth has conceived in her old age. A woman far past her childbearing years is already 6 months pregnant. Now tell me, is there anything the Lord cannot do?"
Mary sat there, quietly. Even now, she could feel God's Spirit emboldening her. Her mind was like a rushing river, slowly narrowing into a quiet stream. She closed her eyes tight and placed a hand on her belly. It was at that moment Mary felt the favor of God upon her. Tears streamed from her eyes, and a smile made its way across her face. She opened her eyes to heaven and laughed. Joy, unimaginable and unexplainable joy. Mary rose to her feet and wiped her tears. She wiped the dust off her dress and smiled at Gabriel. After a deep breath, she looked at him and said,
I am God's servant. I will gladly receive his will according to what you've said.
And with a nod, Gabriel vanished in a vapor. Mary stepped outside. The sun was high in the sky. Mary basked in its rays and looked around to see the village going about its daily rhythm. She listened to the birds whistle along with the slight breeze. The dullness of the day seemed to brighten up immensely. Mary's heart was beating fast. She was still afraid of whatever may come, but she knew in her bones that what Gabriel had said was true. So Mary made arrangements to go visit her cousin Elizabeth to see what God was doing. Mary traveled to the outskirts of Jerusalem into the town of Elizabeth and Zechariah. She had not told anyone why she needed to visit Elizabeth. She didn't quite understand how she would tell people, especially Joseph. So she hoped in God and pondered everything in her heart. Elizabeth was tending to the garden when she saw Mary arrive in a small carriage. She looked up and waved. She was over 6 months pregnant and beaming with joy. Elizabeth made her way towards Mary when all of a sudden she felt a jolt in her womb.
Oh my!
Elizabeth shouted.
Is something wrong?
Mary gasped with concern. Elizabeth laughed and smiled ear to ear, exposing the aged cracks in her face.
My sweet Mary,
Elizabeth said with a grin.
you are with child.
Mary's heart skipped a beat. How did she know? Mary was no more than a couple weeks pregnant. Surely Gabriel did not tell everyone of her miraculous encounter.
Who told you that?
Mary asked, concerned that more people might have known. Elizabeth took Mary's hands in hers.
My child, it is an honor that the mother of the Lord himself should visit me. When you came close, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. He's kicking now, filled with the delight of God's Spirit.
Elizabeth held Mary's face and kissed her forehead.
You are blessed, Mary. This is a burden, yes, but so much good will come of this.
Mary embraced Elizabeth. It was a relief to feel understood. She wondered if her family and Joseph would be as overjoyed. Would they believe her? Would they judge her? Would Joseph still love her? All these questions filled her mind, but the Lord was steadfast towards Mary. he gave her a quiet resolve to press forward. Mary remained with Elizabeth and Zechariah for 3 months. She watched Elizabeth joyfully struggle through pregnancy and Zechariah silently attend to her needs. Even though Zechariah was unable to speak, his love for his wife was shown in his tender care towards her. As the pregnancy grew more and more burdensome, Mary would attend to daily chores and tasks on her cousin's behalf. All the while, a small round bump on the end of Mary's belly was beginning to form. She knew that when she returned to Nazareth, there would be no hiding what had happened. The time had finally come for Elizabeth to give birth. Her cries split the night like a bolt of lightning. Mary remained in the room with Elizabeth and the other women as she pushed, curled, kicked, and screamed. Mary saw strength in her despite her old age and wondered if she too would be that strong when the time came. Hours had passed, but it was finally time. With great agony and determination, she pushed the child through, and the dimly lit room was filled with the lively cries of a newborn boy. Elizabeth held her baby boy in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she looked upon her miracle child.
We will name him Zechariah after his father,
she whispered. Then, after 9 months of silence, a deep voice could be heard from the corner of the room.
No,
Zechariah said. Elizabeth gasped, as did Mary and the others with them. Zechariah smiled and held up his boy.
His name will be John,
he said. The old priest laughed and cried.
You, my little son, will be a prophet of the Most High. You will prepare the way of the Lord. You will point people towards their salvation. You will show them the way. You are a forerunner and chosen by God. The morning light of heaven is breaking on us this day.
Mary took a step outside and looked to the heavens. Her heart was filled with gladness. She laid a gentle hand on her belly and took a deep breath. She was reminded of the story of Abraham, how God once met him in the silence of the night. Abraham looked up to see the expanse of space and all the stars within. It was that night God promised Abraham that through his seed all the nations shall be blessed. And now, under the same stars, Mary was holding within her the answer to that promise.
My soul magnifies you,
Mary whispered. The cool breeze rustled the nearby bushes. Mary kept her eyes fixed on the heavens above.
My spirit rejoices in my Savior. He has looked at me, this humble servant, and considered me. From now on, every generation will call me blessed.
The wind picked up as Mary spoke, as if creation itself was worshiping alongside her. Mary began singing to God.
His mercy is shown to those who fear him, and he has shown strength to those who are proud. He brings down the mighty from their thrones and exalts the humble. He has satisfied the hungry and rushed to the rescue of his people, Israel. He has done what he promised to Abraham so long ago.
Mary closed her eyes and allowed the wind to kiss her cheek. Then, the next morning, she departed back home. It was noon, and the blistering sun was hot against Joseph's back as he worked. The sound of chiseling against stone was music to his ears. He loved being a craftsman. He loved creating something that would be useful and bless people. However, this project was perhaps his finest. While Mary was away helping her cousin, Joseph was working on their new home. He laid the foundation of stone and dreamed about the little pitter-pattering of feet that would run across it. He dreamed of holding Mary in his arms, while he watched his children play. Joseph was anxious for her return and often looked to the road to see if she would be returning on any of the carriages coming in from the city. As Joseph took a break to drink some water, he saw a small carriage in the distance. He raised his hand to block the sun and get a better view. It was her, Mary. Joseph dropped the water skin and ran toward the carriage.
Just wait until she sees the beginning of our new home.
Joseph thought. He couldn't help but smile as he ran. He couldn't wait to see her face, hear her laugh, and watch her grin as he showed her the beginning of their new home.
Mary!
Joseph shouted. As Mary drew closer, something seemed different about her. Joseph slowed down to get a steady look at her belly. As clear as day, a slight bump had formed. Joseph's smile left him. The carriage came to a stop, and Joseph helped Mary step down. As the carriage rode away, the two of them stood there in silence. Joseph's brow was furrowed, his eyes locked on Mary's belly.
Joseph,
Mary said quietly. She tried getting him to look at her, but his face was still.
Joseph, I know what it may look like, but this is not what it seems.
At that point, Joseph's eyes darted up. They were filled with betrayal and sorrow.
What did I do to deserve this?
Joseph asked with a trembling voice.
Have I not treated you with nothing but love and respect? Have I not served your family and treated them as my own? Have I not devoted myself to creating a home for us?
Joseph pointed back to the foundation he had been working on for their new home. He opened his arms and shook his head.
Please, Mary, tell me why I deserve such betrayal.
Mary opened her mouth to speak, but was promptly stopped as Joseph held up his hand. He sighed, holding back tears. His eyes locked with hers.
It does not matter what you say. By law, I have a right to stone you. I could drag you out on the streets and allow people to shame you. But I will not make you a spectacle. Your life will be hard enough. Though my love for you remains, I cannot marry you. We will call off our engagement silently, so that you may hide away with your family.
Joseph was a just man. He was a man of principle, courage, and character. He would not allow anyone to shame Mary for one mistake. He loved her too much for that. Yet he could not marry someone who could betray him in such a way. So he departed from Mary and pondered what his next steps might be. It was late, and Joseph was sitting under the stars on a hill beside his home. The warm evening breeze made the grass around him dance. He laid on his back, gazing up at the sky, asking God for answers. He was raised to believe if he had been faithful, God would bless him with a family. Joseph wrestled the bitterness out of his mind. He loved Mary. He thought she loved him too.
Perhaps I should have listened to her,
he thought. Joseph sighed and closed his eyes. He allowed his mind to wander and the soft breeze to rock him into a deep sleep.
Son of David,
A voice called out to Joseph. Joseph looked round. He was no longer in the field, but beside a stream.
Joseph, son of David.
The voice called out again. Joseph looked up to see an angel perched on a tree planted beside the water. Joseph rose to his feet to get a better look. It was a magnificent creature, and somehow terrifying and friendly at the same time.
Are you afraid, son of David?
The angel asked.
Afraid of what?
Joseph responded.
To take Mary as your wife.
The angel clarified.
Are you afraid?
Joseph nodded. The angel leapt down from the tree and stood face to face with Joseph.
Don't be.
The angel said, matter-of-factly.
The baby is conceived from God's own spirit. She has not betrayed you, Joseph. She has been called by God to bear a great responsibility.
Joseph recalled Mary trying to convince him of such things, but he was too hurt to listen.
What shall I do?
Joseph asked the angel.
What does this all have to do with me? You are chosen, Joseph. You have been chosen by God to care for Mary and the child. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. Jesus?
Joseph asked. He allowed himself to think for a moment. The name Jesus means God saves. Joseph was beginning to understand.
He will save his people from their sins.
Gabriel said.
Recall the words of Isaiah. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Jesus,
Joseph repeated.
God's promised deliverer. And he has chosen Mary and I to raise him.
Joseph looked up to ask the angel more questions, but he had vanished. In that instant, Joseph found himself awake again in the grass. The dawn was beginning to break. Joseph's eyes widened, and an uncontrollable grin swept over his face as he watched the sunrise. He put his hands through his hair and began to laugh. God had chosen him. God had chosen Mary. Joseph thought about Mary. He thought about how hard it would have been to tell him all these things. Joseph sprang to his feet and ran down the hill. He knew where he would find her. Joseph ran down the dusty pathway to the well, stumbling on the occasional hole in the ground. There he saw the dark-haired young woman playfully humming as she drew water. She looked up from the well to see Joseph. The two of them locked eyes. Joseph stepped forward and embraced Mary, wrapping her in his arms. They cried, laughed, and shared a moment of profound resolve. They were going to be married so they might raise and protect the promised seed of Abraham, the son of David, the Prince of Peace, the Savior of the world, Emmanuel, God's very own Son, Jesus Christ.
I want you to put yourself in the position of Abraham, looking at the stars and hearing from the voice of God himself. Imagine that you are the one sitting by the hillside with the evening breeze caressing your cheek. He tells you that you have been chosen to take part in the redemptive arc of humanity and that through you all the world will be blessed. If it were me, I would be in awe while also terrified. I would probably be honored that God would choose to bless me while also scared of the grand responsibility. Mary can relate to Abraham in this way. She was chosen to be blessed above all other people, but also carry a great responsibility. Mary is an extension of the promise made to Abraham. Jesus will be the fulfillment of God's great redemptive plan, and Mary is tied to that story forever. Abraham and Mary have a lot in common, actually. Both were chosen out of obscurity. There was nothing remarkable about Abraham when he was chosen by God. There was no defining features that made Abraham more worthy of the blessing than others. God simply chose him because of his own will. We aren't given any reason as to why Mary was chosen over other women in her tribe. Her and her fiancé Joseph were both descendants of King David, but they certainly weren't the only ones. We aren't given reasons why Mary and Joseph were chosen for the same reason we weren't given any for Abraham. It isn't about who you are when God calls you, it's about who you become when he calls you. Mary and Joseph will rise to the occasion. The calling of God comes with the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of God is all that they need to accomplish the great task ahead of them. The beginning of the episode gave us the context of Jesus' life. Mary and Joseph were members of a humble town called Nazareth, where nothing particularly remarkable ever happened. Later on in the series, we will meet a young man named Nathanael, who will become a member of the 12. When he is told Jesus is from Nazareth, he scoffs and says, "Nazareth? Can any good come from there?" As it turns out, something very good came from Nazareth. The backdrop of our story reminds us that extraordinary things can come from ordinary places. Whatever mundane or bland place we find ourselves in, there will always be potential for something remarkable. Oftentimes, God works within the monotonous and ordinary routines and slowly builds something spectacular over time. But there are other times when God interrupts our passionless patterns with his spirit, sending a meteor crashing down on our boring lives. He calls us to adventure like he called Mary, Joseph, and Abraham, and we have the choice to respond. Mary's mundane routine was interrupted by the presence of the angel Gabriel. The angelic creature perched himself in her room and called her blessed. He relayed God's calling that would change her life forever. Mary's reaction was rather poised when you consider the circumstances. There was a lot on the line for Mary. Put aside the existential responsibility of bearing God's Messiah in your womb and think about the immediate inconvenience. She has to explain this to people knowing that many of them won't believe her, including her fiancé. Mary's destiny comes at a cost to herself. A constant theme in the Gospels is destiny. Christians refer to it as a calling, but the sentiment is the same. We all want to feel like we are destined for something great called a higher purpose, but the calling of God often comes at a cost to us. If you think about it, our calling is similar to Mary's. We are all asked to host God within us and embrace the calling that comes with it. We might have to make tough decisions and face hardship to follow God's calling. Rest assured, what we gain in Jesus outweighs what we lose in the world. Jesus will later on say, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. This is one of the great principles of Scripture. Greatness requires sacrifice. Glory requires surrender. Heaven requires humility. Mary embraced her calling with dignity, but with Joseph, oh, poor Joseph. We can't help but feel sorry for him at first. We know that Mary is carrying the Lord's child, but how is he supposed to process that and take it at face value? Would you take this story seriously at first? Of course not. It would take divine intervention to prove a miracle like this. Before Gabriel comes to visit him in a dream, Joseph determines to divorce Mary secretly. By Jewish law and tradition, he had every right to stone her in the public square, but he was far too kind for that. Kindness. There's a word that many men don't like to embody. The brutality of history and conquest tells us that nice guys typically finish last, but the Bible does its best to instill a different value system. In the ancient world, greatness was shown in strength and an ability to assert your will over others. It wasn't until Judeo-Christian influence that the tide began to shift. Being merciful and humble all of a sudden became greater virtues than strength and pride. Friedrich Nietzsche observed this shift due to Christianity and sought to decry it. He said it replaced strength for weakness. But valuing kindness has been a force for good in history. Joseph could have asserted his force over Mary and punished her, but instead, he showed kindness. This gave room for the voice of God to speak in his life. Joseph showing mercy to Mary gives us flashbacks to all the times David showed mercy when he could have shown vengeance. Joseph truly was a son of David. Joseph eventually came around. He realized what was about to unfold. He and Mary were chosen to bear a heavy burden. They were going to steward God's chosen hero. They would nurse him, change him, teach him, and protect him, all for the purpose of being given up as a sacrifice. What wild and spectacular things lie ahead for them. I am excited to continue this series with you. In our next episode, Mary and Joseph will make the journey to Bethlehem, where the King of the universe will humble himself in the warmth of a manger. Join us for episode 3, God with Us. Thank you again for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. And to expand your Heroes in the Bible journey, download the Heroes of the Faith devotional at tonyevans.org/heroes. Follow the podcast on Apple or Spotify to get the newest episodes right as they come out, and always be inspired by the Bible. God bless.
In Genesis, God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. It's so blessedly simple, right? But with the serious health issues on the rise, you have to wonder how much is related to poor diet lacking in fruits and vegetables. Let me encourage you to get back to basics with Field of Greens. Each fruit and vegetable in Field of Greens was medically selected for its specific health benefit. Some support vital organs like heart, lungs, and kidneys. Others support metabolism for healthy energy and weight loss. Unlike the others with watered-down extracts, Field of Greens uses organic whole fruits and vegetables because that's where the healing nutrients are. How will you know Field of Greens works? At your next checkup, your doctor will notice your improved health or your money back. For 15% off, visit fieldofgreens.com and use promo code Bible. That's fieldofgreens.com, promo code Bible.